The next speaker is Galen Wolfe-Pauly. He's right up here, and he's going to speak about designing robust human systems. So give him a warm welcome, please.
It's Mother's Day, by the way. I won't be mad at anyone who's around that far much. So I'm going to give a really quick. We'll see if I can do this in like 7 minutes, because this talk is really designed more as a discussion. These are things that I think about or that sort of guide my own work, but they're somewhat open-ended or maybe even ill-formed, you could tell me. So I'll give you the overview, and then hopefully we'll sort of dive in a little bit more deeply. So a little bit about me. I trained as an architect, and I really do see everything as architecture, but the way I think about it is sort of like the inverse of the way that most people think about it. So if you think of architecture in the traditional sense of building buildings, people think that architecture has to do with like where you put the walls. It's kind of like this positive act of like where you are building things. But I think about architecture as like how you shape the void that people actually inhabit, right? You're building things that people can be inside of. So architects are really concerned with negative space. They're not really concerned with the things that they add to the world. So, while architects have spent a lot of time thinking about how to build physical systems, the digital tools that we use really haven't existed for all that long. So while what I sort of love about architecture is that it's a discipline with this long history, digital tool making is such a new thing that we don't have, I think, a very like refined system for thinking about it. And if you think about, especially like connected digital tools, basically like tools from the internet, it's really not that old at all. And I would argue that most of the time that we've spent using those connected digital tools, those tools are basically designed to sell you ads. Like that's most of what they do. And so as far as I'm concerned, UI UX is just not a thing. Like I think it's kind of it's just, it doesn't even, in a way, like it doesn't even cross my radar. I kind of like, can't take it seriously because it's not rooted in like kind of like fundamental design principles. So I think that when we think about building software systems, and I think a lot of what people in the crypto world think about when we think about building sort of like large-scale protocols that like all of humanity is going to use to solve some big problem, there's no way, or sort of there's no historical precedent for building an entire system, right? Systems emerge from the use of individual tools. And when I say tools, let's think about tools really broadly. There was, I think one of the first, this is one of these things where I'm like, I know this is a little bit of a loose definition, but just bear with me. So I see buildings as tools for people to communicate and interact inside of. A bridge is basically a tool for people to get from point A to point B. And books really like transmit information from one point to another. We can kind of keep going down this road, but I think we kind of get the definition. So if we're interested in building new human systems, which I think that's what most of sort of ambitious software projects are about, I think it's worth looking at systems that already work, like the home itself, right? Homes are composed of all of these individual elements, furniture, tools for making food, and so on, that all sort of like are used in concert to make a system that actually works for people to live together. Of course, this has been going on for a long time, even in very sort of formal environments. I think shipping systems is another one that, to me, is this like sort of fantastically sort of wild use of many different small parts in order to facilitate a very important and kind of like critical and long-lived human system. Cities, of course, both how they're built and how they sustain themselves. This is really just to kind of give a sense of what I'm talking about. And of course, transportation networks, both how these things are built and then what they sort of like turn into and how they exist in the world. So in general, all I'm saying is that systems in general don't get built all at once, right? We don't design the whole thing, and in most cases where people say, I'm going to design an entire system and implement it all at once, I think of like planned communities, malls, things like that. It actually doesn't really work. Those are generally not very successful. So when I think of the sort of smaller parts, the car itself, individual pieces of furniture, these sort of more constrained sort of design interventions into the world, there are sort of three axes along which they are constrained. And this is what I sort of wanted to dive into a little bit more deeply, hopefully with some discussion. So I think sort of how modular they are, how much they interact with other things, that like how they get used together, whether or not they depend on a network of other things. So of course, if you build a car and there is no road system, the car is not particularly useful. And just the sort of how complicated are they, how simple are they? So to give you an example, or to try and sort of like define these categories visually, let's think about modularity. So I think systems for transporting goods are a good example of that. These things always have to fit together. They fit together basically with each other. Books and bookmaking, so sort of the standardization of how information is carried around the world and how information is delivered. And that's true sort of even at the outset, how we actually record information and share it with each other to coordinate. And these individual pieces, in my view, they sort of have to be very, very constrained, right? And their sort of interfaces with other things in that system also have to be very well defined. Lumber systems and sort of construction, sort of pieces of construction technology, I think like are a good demonstration of like very modular things that can be used together in unexpected ways. I think the tatami mat is probably one of my favorite, in that it like then all of sort of traditional Japanese architecture is built around the module of the tatami mat. So network dependence or independence, I tend to particularly love things that are basically network completely independent. So woodworking tools are a good example. If you're sort of alone in a field with a tree and some woodworking tools, you can actually go about building something. It doesn't really require anything else other than your individual effort. And there's a long tradition of doing this. I love the bridge as the example of like the network independent piece of technology. Like a bridge works if you don't have anything else that gets you across the river. I found this last night and I was thinking this like could be Nike next season or something like that. These are all Roman sandals, so shoes like actually preserve your feet, get you from point A to B faster. So individual the tent is great, like something that you can inhabit alone in the wilderness. You don't really need anything else to use it. It's tools for drawing, or tools for sort of surveying the landscape. So that first one is a sextant and this is a compass. And then I think this is the one that when I think about building digital tools, I find that there's like very, very little precedent for. It's actually kind of a troubling thing, and I feel like people don't think about it very much. But almost all of our digital tools are just way, way too fucking complicated. And so when you look at these pieces of human technology, which have lasted for thousands of years and basically remain useful, I think there's something sort of fascinating to me about when I look at them, I know exactly how to use it just by looking at the thing itself, right? Like a mortar and pestle is useful immediately, almost just in its image, at least as far as I'm concerned. This is a cup. This is a cup out of a coconut from Polynesia that I love. Korean bowl blankets. Which kind of gets into like the issue of like almost like why does adornment matter? I was thinking that the bell, in a way, is like the original text message. it's like a really quick way to alert someone like over a long distance. You don't really need anything else. We have this is a stone knife and a slightly more developed knife. But basically, a critical tool which performs one purpose. You know exactly what it does when you pick it up. And then we have like basically private key generation or gambling, depending on how you look at it. And generation of entropy. So I meant to kind of see how quickly I could get through this. The idea was to kind of give you a bunch of images, let those wash over you, give you this sort of broad picture, try and do that in about 10 minutes, and really try and just have a structured conversation. I'm like well aware of how loose this is. And so what I'm hoping to do is basically try and structure this into, does this premise make sense? That we should try and sort of constrain our design thinking about the things that we make into these kind of categorical distinctions. Do these principles like seem correct, or should we expand on that list, or somehow like either lengthen it or shorten it, or does it actually work? And then can we dive into them and make them even more refined? Or you guys can reject the premise entirely. Yeah.
We talk about robust. What do you mean by robust?
Robust. I guess I tend to judge these things basically on their longevity. So how long do they live for? And then do they span multiple cultures? I feel like that's the thing that I often look at is like, is this something that's emergent in different cultures where the tooling was not necessarily shared? So is it like indicative of some sort of basic human need? So and then when I look at software systems, I want to try and see that sort of repeated, if that makes sense.
Okay. So resilient across time and across cultures.
Yeah.
I think even in the examples that you showed us of things that are sort of self-contained and robust, even they are the product of pretty complex flows of information and kind of labor being applied a lot of times. Like the bridge doesn't just spring up out of its own and like just is there and does its job. It is the product of a lot of labor that has been networked in the past. So when I think about like software systems then, with that in mind, what you're trying to achieve is complete interoperability of very singularly focused tools. Because if you don't have that complete interoperability, the flows between all of those different things, you can't begin to like make individual things do only very simple things because you're trying to make them do more things than that you have.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like, in a way, this kind of idea can go in two directions. One of them is basically like, our software tools are so immature that we can't build in the way that we historically have because this sort of tool chain is not yet. I don't think it's usable in what is sort of the normal or sort of historical way, which is that individuals can sort of freely invent with the sort of materials at hand, like with some simple tools and materials at hand. And so I think that it feels to me like that's basically like the biggest challenge in terms of like building software that is sort of user-centric in the present day. And that's a problem that still hasn't been solved. We've kind of avoided because we're just selling ads. And so that's what's, in some ways, to me, the most interesting thing about the world of basically sort of like crypto and decentralization is that when you change those incentives, you kind of return to this original problem, which is basically like, how do you make this stuff broadly useful?
Yeah, I think one thought I have after Lawrence's comment is like designers. So again, this is related to this your idea of like an artifact is like something quite difficult to produce. Designers have this like timelessness fetish, and what appears from the examples that you gave, you didn't say the word timeless, but you did mention long-lasting, and
I think those might be two different things. I think.
Well, I mean, like timelessness means something different than long-lasting to designers. But what I'll posit is that what we should be concerned with, well, what you're showing is not like objects, but pattern archetypes.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that there's precedent for this in terms of like individual UX patterns in digital design. Some of them are well understood. There are some new ones still being figured out, and that's good. But there aren't many. Those like patterns are almost like the tool primitives. They're almost like the knives, the tool sets that we need to build larger patterns. For example, it doesn't seem to be figured out exactly how a login flow should be, or how like a payment should work. There are lots of different opinions on how to institute like a checkout process, and the only ones that have large traction are the ones that happen to be are like the ones where like the product has large traction, such as Shopify, for example.
Sure.
So yeah, I guess you're making me think about
like, I mean, another way to like kind of direct, or the way I think about this criticism is also basically like that these things are way too monolithic, and so it's true that when you kind of rend them apart, you see that we have exist some patterns that maybe start to make sense, or that seem like they're beginning to work on their own. But I mean, for like so authentication, which is somewhat related to in a way key management, to me remains totally unsolved. Even like a fundamental, just like how should we think about this as a design problem? What makes sense to people in terms of like just holding a secret, holding something that is valuable to them. It feels like you have to wind it back quite a ways in order to like move forward towards like a solution. And I don't know if a Shopify login is quite the answer. Yeah, there's two of you, Lawrence.
I'm
You're first. Sorry.
I guess I started by exploring when we look at things like the stone bowl, the bridge,
Yeah.
where our intuition comes from, that these are more simple and more network independent and so forth. And one of the things it feels like is useful to surface is that they've been around for such a long time that there's like this thick layer of cultural understanding and acceptance that these are useful and patterns that are perpetuated and keep making more instances of. And in the software world as a whole, it's just so much newer that it's hard to say what's what there. But even within the software world, as a practicing software developer, I think we can find examples of those things in the things we take for granted that we don't even think of as tools anymore. And so what comes up for me is things like files, right? The Unix pipeline,
CP,
right? Passwords. Passwords are a tool, right? They have a tool. They have trade-offs and pros and cons. But those are the level of small tools from which we build larger tools.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the disconnect, though, is between that tool chain, in my mind anyway, and basically like kind of consumer tooling. So there's a huge gap there in terms of kind of the complexity of interface and the complexity of tooling. And that's, I mean, it is what it is, but it's a little bit confusing, I think.
Kind of like the word tool needs to break down there, right? Because the whole idea of a consumer is the one who doesn't use them, so they just have an experience.
Yeah,
you wouldn't necessarily say a circus is a tool.
Right. So I tend to think of them like, so think about the home, right? You pick up furniture, you arrange your furniture, you decide how to sort of set up your kitchen. Ordinary people, remodel their own homes. I think that like there's kind of a smooth transition that people can usually make with regards to their personal space, their cars, their, the land that they own or whatever, in terms of modifying it in whatever like way that they see fit. But that's very difficult in the world of software, and that's just a weird, to me, it's like kind of a strange disconnect, right? I don't know, it sort of seems wrong, basically. I go to Alan.
Yeah, going back to the whole idea of timelessness and what it means, how do you factor in, like, eons of, human history? And like a good example, something that sort of came out of mind was the movie 2001: Space Odyssey, where you have, the whole movie is literally divided up into sequences of like, historic breaking points in human history, where it's like things that seem so, advanced and unknowable all of a sudden within, 1 second just become like, obviously, like one person figures something out, you see some pattern, and starts sharing it, and then that pattern then becomes so obvious to so many people. Like you look at even with like what's happening with like blockchain and Bitcoin and stuff, things that people thought, a few years ago were impossible, and slowly but surely sort of, these patterns become more apparent, and I'm just sort of wondering how that factors into what you're trying to say with timelessness, where, things that seem very complex, like, you look at, YouTube videos of, people started talking about the internet or Windows 95, the GUI where it became mainstream, like no one knew how to use it. You have to like literally explain to people what dragging and dropping things were. And now, as, you see kids with like an iPad, and before they can even talk, they're like, able to use it. So the question is like, what is timelessness? Like where do you stand on the line?
I think that in a way, what I'm concerned with is kind of making it, the only kind of real recommendation that I have, and this is just something that I feel like I've learned in my own work, is that like, it takes a long time for sort of humanity as a whole to figure out like the size and complexity of the things that they want to use. And that digital tooling is we still don't really know. And it's very early and it takes a long time. And so basically, it's actually better to scale back our ambitions in some ways and be realistic about the like level of complexity of sort of things that we can make and successfully like deploy into the world. Someone earlier was talking about that Sabo essay about the clock. And so I think that's a really good example of like, when I look at this whole universe of crypto, I'm like, I mean, what makes Bitcoin truly amazing is its simplicity and straightforwardness. It makes no like complex claims about what it's going to do or what it's going to be. It's just money. That's it. And that I actually think of as like a fantastic design choice. Like that's really, really incredible to be able to just say, we're just going to do exactly one thing, that's it. And then I think, and when I look at, we're pretty far down the line here, and I think it starts to feel a little bit baroque, right? Where the ambition has started to kind of like get out of pace with like what's actually possible and like what people can actually put to use. If that makes sense. Do you want to? Go ahead. Trying to keep you guys.
Oh, absolutely. Well, from a bunch of people, Moritz and a few people mentioned the complexity that goes into making artifacts, but so I don't want to repeat that, but on that idea, a lot of the artifacts that you have there, museum pieces, they have this elegance and simplicity to them. On the other hand, they're kind of divorced from the context in which they're in. So for instance, that bell made it look like it had a loop on it, which means that it was probably attached to something else. And who knows how, and you mentioned the word adorn in the context of one of those artifacts. So there's like a sort of sense of decoration that I think maybe you're opposed to. I could be wrong, but but I guess my question is, like, when you take these things out of context, there is sort of an ornamentation that is lost. And so they appear simple, but maybe they're part of some massive Baroque, in this case, an assemblage or whatever you want to say. And so, how does that factor into your idea of what simplicity is?
I think that the main way that I think about it is just that they can be taken out, like they can be removed. So I think that that's like
the modular part.
Yeah, well, no, I think the way that I think about simplicity is basically like you can remove the bell from, it could have been on some, wild like samurai costume or whatever, right? But you can still remove it and it still serves its purpose. And so it's simple in as much as it only aspires to do one thing, right? It just makes noise. That's it. And so I think, does that make sense?
I can see that.
Yeah. I think how we compose these things end up, they're certainly like in context. It's like kind of like it's almost like historically bound, and that's fine. That is what it is.
So from my perspective, it seems like we are still groping in the software world or computer world in general for the fundamental building block that like is scalable across different scales. Yeah. So the fractal that can repeat at different scales.
Right. Yeah.
And so the thing that struck me most about the work of the kind of metacurrency and scepter people is that they've decided to put at the fundamental unit not code and like ASCII text in files, but instead semantic trees. Like as logically structured hierarchical data that is in embodied rules and embodied relationships to each other, rather than the relationships between the different parts being a logical relationship that is like kind of, we have separate files that make those happen between them. But so as software programmers right now, people build these hugely complex systems with these huge ontologies, which are only readable by them. And so
or by that code base, basically.
Right. And so I think that the shift starts to happen that we have these kind of modular tools once we have those fundamental building blocks, and they can all exist in hierarchical relationships to greater and greater scales of that.
Yeah, the tension, the thing that's really interesting to me is basically that like we also have a world that's covered in data centers, right? So we live in a world in which basically Unix is one, and it actually works fine, and it's everywhere. And yet, it's extremely monolithic, and it's extremely complicated, and it's basically not usable by the individual. So it does, in my mind, remains an open question whether or not the kind of like Unix paradigm is the right paradigm, and I think it basically breaks all of my rules. However, it seems to work, and worse is better apparently is true. So I think that's that's the interesting conundrum basically about the apparent immaturity of software systems and like how they sort of are not in line with basically what I see as like normal sort of building processes in human history. And yet, everybody uses them and it seems to work. So I think that's where the kind of crisis lies, I think, for the designer, and that's also sort of what's basically interesting. Sorry, you get, we'll go to you next.
It was perfect what Mark said, because I'm one of the Scepter people, and I've been hypothesizing holoxal, holographic pixel.
Okay.
So going back to how you opened, you're talking about space and architecture, and I was trying to fit that with the second and third parts of what you were talking about. So if you have a screen and you were trying to discover basic design principles, for me, if you're thinking of it in terms of the space, it's what like cybernetic affordances are introduced into the void by what's on the screen. So then you have to get into like the relation between information and space, and if you were just trying to save like the quality of a space and its affordances, if you were like trying to compress that into a file or something, how would you do that in a way that was those things that you said, you could take it with you and then show it to someone and open it up somewhere else and say like, look, this is what that space is like, I can describe it to you.
I think, the way I think about, that's interesting. I think the way I think about, well, there are two things. So I've heard a number of people, different people over the last couple of days. I just noticed this, maybe because I've been thinking about this, talk about the internet as a place. They refer to things on the internet as places. And sort of using the same sort of spatial orientation like language to talk about websites, basically, right, which are flat or non-spatial in the traditional sense. But I think that if you think about the way that you, say, move around a city now that you use a mapping program on your phone, that's kind of the way in which I see, it's very clear that software affects the way that we actually inhabit the real world. So I'm less concerned with like how we have a sort of somewhat spatial experience inside a computer. Well, I mean, it is interesting, but I feel like those effects are already like, very real in terms of the way, both the way we think about it, the way we conceptualize digital space, and the way it impacts like the way that we actually sort of like physically go about our daily lives. That makes sense. Maybe that's like an important part. I don't know. You guys can.
I kind of wanted to return to what Eli was saying and ask, like, do you see value in aesthetics? Because you talked about, you were very dismissive when you talked about like UI and UX.
Yeah.
And I think aesthetics are like ingrained in those. And then you also said that why do adornments even matter?
Yeah.
So that shocked me, to be honest. So I'm wondering, like, to what extent do you see those as having utility?
I do think they have utility. That's a good question. It might be something that I try to kind of stay somewhat open about, so that's why I try to negate them. So they obviously have a lot of utility, but in a way, I think, like, did you hear Toby talk prior? Or were you here?
Yeah.
Okay, so like I think that I've always seen aesthetics as being in constant flux. And so because of their sort of like, they're basically kind of like the spirit of the age, and that's always changing. And so there's a big difference between the kind of like, kind of tectonic structure of how things are used and how they interact with our lives, and like what gets kind of painted on the outside. What gets painted on the outside is important, and I think it does matter a lot, but maybe it's just like I think of them as really different things.
So is it, I'm sorry, is it that you find simplicity to be more timeless then?
I think that like, maybe it's like, again, maybe the prior is kind of like, if you want to build things that sort of shape the way that the world is, and you look at the things that people have used historically that really shape the way that the systems that the world sort of operates under work, those things are generally really simple, right? Like and I don't think that, the interesting thing, for example, was like looking through the like, Natural History Museum's collection of knives. And it's like, knives from the American West look really different from like Japanese knives of 100 years ago. And they perform the same function, but with a totally different aesthetic sensibility. So it's sort of like, can we make judgments about the sort of design constraints of these objects outside of their sort of like aesthetic specifics? Does that make sense?
It does. It's just, I find it a little ironic because the items that you chose were all very beautiful items, with the exception of the crates.
Yeah, the crates.
Yeah, well, not the milk crates, the shipping containers,
yeah.
which are basically trash. Like they get used and then they end up in America and you can't ship them back to China, so they end up as homes sorted sometimes, but mostly just piling up.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because like a beautiful box gets saved. They end up in museums. They end up being treasured. Like everybody in here probably has some sort of Apple box at home that they've
I don't know if the I wonder if that's true. I think that, to me, that's kind of an open question. Like, I think of like the mortar and pestle is like something that was probably just purely utilitarian object that no one thought about, right? And that now they look really beautiful because they are sort of, they look timeless to us. They don't bear any like aesthetic kind of markings.
But I think that I'm sorry, I'm just.
It's all right.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think part of what's seen is that the marginal cost of creating something physical has gone down a lot, and so we don't care so much about the dormant, but if you only have like one word vessel for your entire life, you do have to be caring about it, which is good.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say was, I feel like you're sort of trying to have us orbit this principled center of design quality, and it's really difficult to figure out how to get back to there from digital tools because there's already such a high degree of what you call network dependence when we're talking about digital tools at all. Right? You're talking about the on-demand architecture and integrated circuits and then the factories and distribution systems for all those things. So that if we want to talk about simplicity at all, it seems like it's simplicity relative to use, right? Relative to user.
That's interesting. Yeah,
and
sure.
then in that context, I think it's really important to talk about embodiment and sort of how do we interact with the technology given what we already have, like the bodies and the hands and the eyes and so forth. And that is the strain that connects the mortar and pestle with the iPad. Right? That's why they can use it because we have language, because we have a hand.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I think it's like, I don't necessarily believe that like you're actually going to get rid of like this entire stack, like sort of historical computing stack, internet architecture. Like, I don't think it's reasonable to think that when we design digital tools, they're ever going to be as long-lived as the mortar and pestle. It's just like, can you sort of return to core design principles and basically make an effort to separate aesthetics from kind of core design principles that surround how things get used. Does that make sense?
Yes, but you can only go so far with the separation because if simplicity and usability are about the relationship between the person and the thing, then aesthetics is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And not just in the thing and nonsense, but like the way in which an object holds your attention, right, informs your use of it.
I think that's right. I think that it's possible to conceive of like the thing's intended use and how it is like it's intended to be used, and then kind of like you aesthetics give it are like instructive in a way. Like I mean that's sort of like personal. I actually like this is great. Like I like that there's a real divide on this issue because it might depend on your sort of personal product. Like for me, it's very important to keep those things separate. That in a way aesthetics are kind of like instructive. They like give information to the individual about how the thing should, it's like almost like onboarding, basically. But I try and think very sort of like, I try and separate those things entirely, like how's the thing actually going to get used? Behind you and then you. Yeah, sorry.
I was thinking
I'm trying to go by what hand I see first, but sorry.
No worries. I just wanted to point out that I think that there were a lot of complex design decisions that were programmed in each one of those artifacts. That the value of those decisions was obfuscated, and there's value in the obfuscation at a certain scale, and that there's elegance that comes out of those decisions, and that we see as simplicity, and yet it's important not to omit those decisions when you're programming something. And I was thinking of the compass in your display as a very elegant example of making the invisible visible using good design. And sometimes to extrapolate out into the future, I would imagine that the most elegant solution to a programmable tool would be to allow it to self-program to solve the problem. You just gave it the problem and allowed it to program itself to solve the problem.
That's like always been whenever I end up in like a deep argument about AI, that's always I'm like, show me an AI that can actually solve design problems, and we can like talk about the long-term horrible future we're going in or whatever. Right. But yeah, I love that. I agree that, and I also agree that like I think that people vastly underestimate how difficult it is to make things that are sort of viscerally simple to understand. It's incredibly hard.
I think it's important to look at Christopher Alexander's work about producing light within structure, and how the relationship of things can produce more light within that structure by making good decisions about where they go to each other.
I
I've read 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I don't know which one of the nature. But the nature order, I would say it's probably 2, because it's not 4 and it's not 3.
I think like those are the books that get the closest. So I think of Alexander as being basically totally not pedagogical, which I think is like his biggest downfall. And so huge, like love Alexander's work, but I think that in an age where sort of like the complexity of design problems I think has increased quite a lot. Like his observations are fantastic, but it's like we need to figure out how to turn that into something much more like a system of thinking about making things, basically, which I think is like where he kind of left off. But yeah.
Okay, so building off of Lawrence and Galen, I mean, I guess I can't really get out of the Heideggerian pool here, where you're just treating these complex objects as extensions of ourselves until we don't quite understand them. They're complex insofar as what we do, what we want to do is complex. Like a paintbrush, for example. I can just do a few strokes, or I can create the Mona Lisa, and nobody can know how unless they're me. You're building something that exists inside a system that involves ourselves to a certain point, and you have to situate yourself in it. But what I think you're getting at this right here with these tools is our ability to like carry them across these different traditions, across these perspectives. I mean, we're all wired differently. We can all do things in different ways. And these tools have this excellence that kind of reaches, Aristotelian excellence that reaches across the board and is superior to the artistic side of their work. It's, I'm putting together two almost contradictory strands right here. And favoring the scientific function in Aristotelian terms, where there's an order to what an object can do or can't do, rather than this in and of itself creative potential for it.
Right. Yeah, I guess the thing, when I look at those things, I think I'm just thinking about the fact that they were made, like they were also designed, and that's sort of that's the task of anyone who kind of like makes things they do, or like that's the kind of underlying task when you make something that other people use, is that you're trying to sort of like achieve that level of like breadth of usability or something like that, or at least that you can understand how to do that. Yeah.
I think like Apple is a really interesting, almost counterexample of what you're talking about, because it has this illusion of simplicity, and the aesthetics of its products almost conceal.
Right. It's very frustrating. Like, because Apple design is at once like they get this and they do an incredible job in some cases, but through this like super like crazy amount of effort to basically make it hidden. How it gets done.
It's almost like the end point of like our complete departure from the kinds of tools that you're talking about. And in that departure, we return to the illusion of what they were. And we're like, the average person doesn't ever really need to like know what's underneath the hood, but
yeah, it's super depressing, honestly. Like, I mean, it's both amazing and I think also kind of upsetting, where it's like, it's frustrating. I don't have a good solve for that.
I guess the question that raises for me is like, how do we get the average like non-technical person to care that like their iPhone is not the same as like a hammer, in the sense that if Apple disappeared, your iPhone would be no good, but like your hammer would be good, no matter what happened, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, 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 very hard problem. Basically,
Yeah, I mean, just on Apple, I sort of see Apple as contending with these sort of principles too, because on one level, sure, they're bearing the complexity, but also, like if you look at the Apple Watch, I would say that the reason why the Apple Watch hasn't been such a successful product is because V1 was way too complex. And what happened was there's the basic interface of the Apple Watch, which is sort of the one-tap the one-tap actions, which I would argue are the good parts of the Apple Watch. But where Apple went wrong was they added the app layer, which introduced way too much complexity into V1. And you can sort of see Apple, as they move forward, to pare down the complexity, move back towards simplicity, towards being a fitness-first tool of technology and whatnot. And then now, the reason why I think the AirPods are the best Apple product since the iPhone, and it's funny because if you have AirPods, you probably agree. If you don't, you probably think I'm crazy saying that. But it gets at the point that the AirPods are elegant and wonderful because they're so simple to the point of triviality.
Yeah, I actually agree. I have AirPods. But I think that I think it basically to the previous point, it's kind of like the point, the kind of the crisis in all of this is like the reason those things work really well is because those guys own the whole thing, and they can invent that whole chain all the way through, and it's pretty cool. But to unseat that ability, or even to just slightly democratize it, is insanely hard. I mean, I do think I'm very biased to think that it's possible, but it's. Sometimes one thing I wonder about a lot is basically did that feel the same way when you were an amateur blacksmith and you're looking at the swords of the day? You know what I mean? Man, those guys do amazing work. I wonder if I could ever do that. But I think it's a little bit different because it's outside of the scope of the individual work. I can't. But I think it's an open question, right? Is that a categorical difference, just based on the scale of what someone like Apple can undertake? And I think certainly for people who work on crypto systems, and we're sort of this, this whole outsider group of people working on technology that could potentially unseat the sort of existing incumbent, right? And I feel like it's a little bit different, basically. So yeah, I don't know, sort of a tangent, but yeah.
Okay, so I think what's been said about Apple here and about the impossibility of democratizing something like AirPods is important, and I want to connect that and a few strains of thought, and at the same time resolve this Platonic Heideggerian divide.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, so obviously the points that have been made about aesthetics are real, because aesthetics communicate meanings, and it's the meanings of it's what the object means to the user that communicates what the user is going to do with it. That's basic affordances stuff, and what you said about the intent of the designer, or what these objects are supposed to do, is not really valid in one sense, because because again, that meaning is not up for the designer to decide, it's up to the user, and all the designer can do is create the right affordances, which includes aesthetic ones, right? That's why I think it's important to return to the idea of patterns, because I think what you are showing up there are, maybe you conflated this initially, but what I think is important to take away from the objects that you showed is not the objects, but their pattern of use, which is a human construct that can be Platonic. It can be a Platonic object, like a wheel, not as the object, but as a thing that rolls, the job that it does, or a bell as a thing that rings. And now to take this back to what Drew was saying about Apple hardware, and the difficulty of people being able to actually work with patterns themselves. We need to not think about hardware and think about software, because that's what we're talking about ultimately. Yeah, we need to, what it strikes me that people need in general is a way to remix and organize the patterns that we have, high-level patterns like logins and streams, for example. A stream as like a feed of information is like a really high-level pattern that can be implemented in many different ways to communicate many different types of use cases. Just like the Facebook use case feels very different than the Twitter use case. And what it appears to me is missing from this scenario is a way for users to actually like remix their tools in a way, like decide to like take a stream and like plug in a feed of data to it in like a very simple way so that they can create the tool that they want to have. And if you see the problem from that perspective, then you understand that like locked APIs are really fucking us over, and that we need like standardized metadata standards.
So,
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Yeah, okay.
yeah, so I kind of want to like propose that there's a sense in which this is already happening. So like you can talk about apples in a way as kind of cool of like personal computer designs, but I think you can read the past 10 years as like the unseating of Apple and the idea of personal computer. Via AWS APIs, web services, and like monolithic entities like Facebook, you end up with kind of like, oh, and also not to forget like the object-oriented programming model. So if you think of like Alan Kay's original proposition of object-oriented programming, it was sort of like an attempt to imagine that computing should actually be kind of like a simple composition of elements and like a monolithically structured system, which sort of succeeded but sort of failed. And then I see like kind of the move to distributed computing as the kind of like actual realization of that vision. So if you like, rather than thinking of the complexity of the Linux stack, you say like just like bundle that into an object, and then you have like a sort of distributed computing network that you layer on like a simple composable interface on top of. And then I think so. I think you can read a lot of what's happening now as sort of like thrusts or attempts towards like finding simplicity. So like blockchains, for instance, are kind of like an attempt to create like a notion of global state, and so which may or may not be kind of like actually. I guess it's kind of like, it's like a new pattern that also has this element of simplicity. So there's only one state, and that's what it is. I don't know, that's pretty disconnected, but like you can kind of see like the writing on the wall for something like Facebook, because Facebook is kind of like born out of the idea of creating like composable APIs on top of like a kind of like homogeneous platform of distributed computers, except it has this sort of like it doesn't have this remixability quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might like. Maybe if you take this entire line of thought as basically a criticism, which in some ways maybe it just is, in that like if we just have very few digital tools that sort of reflect these fundamental kind of design principles or design values, then the one kind of real hope for like sort of the distributed web, blockchain, and so on, is that like if you were to make computing infrastructure much more sort of democratically available or widely available, that's how you kind of like get a much higher degree of remixability, or like you get these things that can be iterated on much more quickly by many, many more people. I think that's actually pretty. I feel like we should wrap it there because that's the optimistic. That may be the optimistic outcome. Anyway, thanks for indulging me, guys. It's like I kind of want to use this as like a tool to kind of advance my own thinking. Yeah, exactly. I figured we'd try and refactor something, while we're here. Anyway, yeah, thanks.